Ever want to stick your toes into laser engraving? Well, stick around. This may be just the tool you're looking for. Let me start by saying that nothing in this video was a gift. I'm not being paid to promote this or anything of that nature. I purchased this on my own for myself, and I will put a link in the description for Amazon where I got it from. As you can see, the engraver came extremely well packaged. I mean, everything had its own little nook, its own little cranny, was wrapped, protected. Even the bars that were laying on top of each other are wrapped with cellophane. Extremely well protected. I was very impressed. One thing to be wary of, and I didn't realize, is that everything's on a single layer. I tried pulling it out looking for a second layer, but everything's on the first layer. They're just hidden in little cubbies with insulating foam between them. So once you think you've found everything, keep digging, because every time I thought I was done, I found another part hidden below something else. So keep digging, pull out the plastic or pull out the foam to make sure that it's empty. You can tell by the weight that there's other things hidden in there, so keep pulling. And one last little plug on just how well they pack this thing. You can even see they put cardboard extra cutouts in the corners to make sure it doesn't get crushed. And it worked, because my Amazon box was crushed, but this thing was perfectly fine. Assembly itself is pretty straightforward and easy. It took me a grand total of about 30 minutes to unbox and put the whole thing together, but a good portion of that time was spent trying to show the various pieces off for the camera for this video. If you just dedicate yourself to assembling it, you could probably have it together in about 15 minutes, maybe faster if you don't bother looking at the directions. First item on the docket is assembling the frame. It has a grand total of 8 screws, and it's nice and conveniently labeled. The bags, each bag is labeled by stage, as is the pictures for the construction. So it makes it really easy, really simple. The bars on the sides themselves have recessed holes that you can actually see so that screws fit in nice and flush and they don't stick out, so that they're not going to block anything. Make sure when you're laying out the frame that the side with the markings goes on the left side. This is also the side with the limit switch attached. The easiest way I found to do the screws was to actually insert them by hand. Much faster than trying to do it with the Allen wrench, and there's actually plenty of screws sticking out to get a good grip and put them in most of the way. Once you've got all the screws inserted by hand, then you can tighten them up with the Allen wrench. Now, while probably not necessary, I elected to use my carpenter square to make sure that all the corners were nice and square so that I wouldn't have any trouble when I put the gantry onto the frame. Once everything's nice and square, make sure that all the screws are nice and tight. Now do be careful, remember these are just aluminum frames. If you over tighten it, you will strip them out, so be careful. In step number 2, we're going to be installing the gantry and the legs. Now this is where the manual and real world differ slightly. The picture I have up now is actually accurate. The one in the book, however, is a little bit vague on the installation process and has some errors into it. First, as you can see, the limit switch blocks gantry install from the front, meaning you have to install the gantry from the rear. Next, we're going to install the legs. There are 3 identical legs with 2 holes on one side and 1 hole in the other with a notch cut out at the 90 point. You're going to install it with the notch aligned to the outer edge and the 2 screw holes aligned to the top so they can line up with the holes in the metal extrusions. Just as in step 1, there are 8 screws for this step as well, 2 for each one of the legs. You may notice that there's one smaller screw than the rest. This one actually goes into the control panel, which does both the control panel and acts as the front left leg. This is also where the second error in the manual comes into play. The manual would have you install the front control panel leg now. However, if you do so, it will block you from being able to install the T-nut that's going to mark or lock down the cabling on that side. So leave that one small screw out so that you can move the control panel out of the way, as I'm doing now, so that we can install the T-nut when we get to that point. And that brings us to step 3, which is by far the most challenging of the steps. Not that it's necessarily hard, but it's kind of tedious feeding the belts through to all the different pulleys. So take your time, go slow, use something that is not sharp edged. I used the Allen wrenches when I was doing it since they're nice and rounded. That way you don't end up nicking, bending, or damaging the aluminum extrusions and thus causing problems with your wheels or the belt itself. The belt can be fed from either the front or the back. It goes under the outside wheel, through, up, over the sprocket, back down, and under the second wheel. Kind of hard to do, but like I said, patience and time, and it'll be alright. When feeding the belt through, make sure the teeth are down, pointed at the timing gear. When doing the belts, I recommend feeding them both through before locking them down. It makes it a little bit easier to be able to move the gantry without it actually being stuck or having any resistance. Once we've got both belts installed, it's time to install the T-locks. Essentially, you're just sliding these in and screwing them down to tighten on the belt to hold it in place. As you can see, this is why we left that screw out of the front panel plate. If you had installed it completely, we would have been unable to put that T-nut in and thus couldn't lock down the belt. Now here's where the book and I differ. The book basically has you splitting the belts evenly between the front and the back. I elected to put most of the excess belt in the back and not to cut it off like the book recommends. I did this because I wanted to have both a little extra belt in case something went wrong, as well as I hope to maybe make and install some kind of belt tensioning device later on. The lack of any kind of mechanical belt tensioner means to you when installing the belt you need to make sure that it's at a proper tension before tightening down the second T-nut. Now when doing this, you want it tight enough that you don't have any play in the gears or in the pulleys, but loose enough that you're not putting any undue stress on any of the mechanics, because it'll wear out the machine that much quicker. For the most part, just pull it snug, tighten it down, and then flick the belt a little bit. It should give a nice twang sound. Once you're done with the belts, you can install the second screw on the front console panel and complete this step. Step 4 is arguably the easiest step of the whole process, being that all you have to do is unbag the laser, slide it down, and tighten it on. That being said, the manual does give a little bit of extra instruction so that you can adjust. There is a secondary plate that the laser mounts to that can be moved up and down to increase or decrease the amount of laser focus depending on the size of the items you may be trying to engrave. Once you have the height adjusted where you want it, locking it down is as simple as twisting the knob on the front until it's snug. In step 5, we'll be tightening the eccentric nuts on the X and Y axis. We want to tighten it down enough that the axis itself doesn't have any wobble or slop. However, we want to be careful not to over tighten them to the point where they will either bog down the motor or cause undue wear on the wheels. And finally, in step 6, we get to hook up the cables. The cables themselves are zip tied together, connected to the main control unit. Be careful cutting them open or cutting them apart so that you don't cut any of the cables on accident. Much like everything else on this engraver, AtomStack thought ahead, and the cables are very self-explanatory. The cable links and the connector types can only fit to one thing at a time, so it's very obvious what plug goes into what hole. Once you've got all the cables connected, the next step is to zip tie them to the chassis itself. Make sure when you're zip tying them together that you leave enough slack in the cables that they can make full extension both on the X and the Y axes without getting any binding or plugging, and make sure they're not going to get wrapped or wound around anything else. Once you've got all the zip ties attached, the last thing to do is to hook up the control display with the supplied HDMI cable and plug it in. The X7 Pro is compatible with both the free Laser GRBL or Laser Gerbil, as well as the paid Lightburn software. The software installation page of the provided manual also gives the links to both of those softwares. However, it's probably faster just to Google them. Other than the links, the manual really doesn't provide any guidance on the software. However, the online manual does, and I highly recommend going to the website and downloading it. I will provide a link in the description. Regardless of which software you choose to use, you will need to download the driver so that your computer can actually see your engraver. For those of you who have used the Wi-Fi Arduinos, probably already have this installed. If not, again, I will provide a link in the description. I've elected to use Lightburn. Number one, it has more capabilities according to all of the different tutorials I've watched, and number two, it gives you a 30-day free trial. After installing the software, you can start your free trial. Of course, you must accept their user agreement. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this, Lightburn is currently unable to auto-detect the engraver, so we're going to have to add it manually. To do this, select the Create Manually button, scroll down until you find GRBL, select it, and hit Next. From there, select your connection type. For us, it'll be USB, and then you get the opportunity to relabel your connection as well as set up the parameters. Now, if you're like me and you're not sure what the parameters are right off the top of your head, which one's X, which one's Y, no problem. We can find that out from the engraver itself. Once the engraver is online, select Settings and then select About. This screen will show you your parameters for the engraver. Now that we know the correct links for X and Y, we can enter them in the correct places and hit Next. Our limit switches are located on the left and the front, so we'll leave it selected for left front and then hit Finish. And with that, Lightburn is all set up, hit OK, and we're ready to start cooking. To do my initial testing, my wife was kind enough to pick me up these nice little wooden blanks. I believe they're made out of birch, but the label doesn't specify. After running the initial test burn, I was able to measure the thickness, and they ended up being just over 1.5 millimeters. For the initial burn itself, I used this grid made by Brandon over at the Make It Break shop. which does a good job of letting you test out both speeds and powers to see what the best mode or the best settings are for the particular material that you're trying to use. As with everything else, I'll put a link in the description so you can download that file as well and visit the Make or Break shop. The test file took about 15 minutes to run, and when it was done I was able to see which power and speed setting I thought looked best so that I could try out another burn. Using what I learned from the first burn, I decided to make something a little bit different and make a picture for my son. Since my son's a gamer like me, I figured I'd find something game related, and since he's been playing a lot of Destiny lately, I figured I'd go with that. I simply pulled up Google, typed in Destiny logo, and scrolled down till I found something I liked. Ended up going with the Raid logo, and I found one that had a nice black with a white background so that it would just do black and white. I figured for the first real picture, I didn't want to mess with grayscale or anything like that just yet, especially not till I get an air assist installed. One thing to note that kind of caught me off guard is that power to speed scale that we used earlier to determine the best burn is in millimeters per minute. For me at least, Lightburn defaulted to millimeters per second, so the first couple times I tried to make this, it obviously didn't go very well. Once I figured that out, changed the settings inside of Lightburn, it worked beautifully. This image itself turned out to be about 5 inches by 5 inches after it was burned and took about 45 minutes. However, I did not do the fastest setting. I used a 70% power with a medium speed setting for my first one. You could probably greatly increase this if you tried a higher speed setting with a higher power. While I have by no means done a comprehensive test of the machine yet, so far I'm having a lot of fun with it. I think the thing is great. I do have several other add-ons and modifications that I want to do to it. Like I said earlier, I'm going to be adding on an air assist. I intend to make some 3D printed legs to lift it up so that I can put a honeycomb mesh underneath, as well as a table for, or the spindle for doing the cups and glasses, which I also have. And I'll be doing videos on those as it comes up. I know I'm going to invariably get some comments about things I did or did not do in the video, and I know there's a few of them that I wanted to touch on quickly. The end plugs in the extrusion, I know the manual has to put them in, and I know that they're there. I elected not to do so because, again, I want to do some modifications, put some covers on, things like that for my 3D printer. Number 2, the zip ties. I know I didn't zip tie the cables on very securely, but again, I'm going to be adding an air assist, so I'm going to have to take all those off and add in the hose later, so I didn't want to waste anything I didn't have to. I only put enough in there to do the initial testing. The online manual, you can get that from the link in the description below, coming from AtomStack. It's a much better manual than the one that comes with the printer itself, so again, I highly recommend downloading and using that for both the assembly and for the use of the thing. And lastly, make sure if you're going to be doing laser engraving, get yourself a good pair of glasses. This printer operates at 455 nanometers, so whenever you're buying safety glasses or looking for safety glasses online, ensure that they match the frequency of the laser that you're using. That way you're protected. Yes, this laser has almost a full coverage of protection, but you can never be too safe.